Good morning. We just had our 5-6 class from EFI join us. Good morning, guys. Come on in. I do have up on the screen a little trivia question for you while we wait for our schools to come in. I know we're getting to the end of the school year. Getting us organized right at 10 o'clock can be a little bit tricky, so we'll give you guys a few extra minutes to get settled. While we're waiting for our schools to come in, if you wouldn't mind, I have some fun trivia for us. So you can go ahead and just type your students' answers right into the chat. And as well, if you're joining us from YouTube, feel free to answer in the chat as well. We can see both of your responses. So just because you're on YouTube doesn't mean you can't interact with us. So you can go ahead and pop those answers into the chat and we'll see how you guys do. So our first trivia question here is, which of these wolf facts are false? So we are going to be talking about wolves today. I looked up some good, interesting facts about wolves. 3 of these are true. 1 of them is false. So let's see if you guys can guess which one of these is not true. So wolves can live in packs up to 30. A common food source is ungulates. And if you don't know what those are, we're going to talk about them today. They weigh about 5 pounds at birth, or they can live up to 16 years in captivity. So find your little chat button at the bottom of the screen. Let us know which of these you think is a false wolf fact. Which one am I trying to trick you guys with? And you don't have to type the entire word. You can just say A, B, C, or D. Go ahead and pop it in the chat and let's see what we get for this one. We'll leave it up maybe just for a couple minutes because I have a few good questions for you guys here. Good morning. I see a few more people popping in here. Noah and Javi, good morning to you too. Thanks again for joining us. It's nice to see you guys. You guys are usually very good at the trivia, so I would love to see what you think about my wolf trivia here. Oh, as well, if you are just popping in, it would be great if you guys could let us know where you're joining from. So you'll notice the names of some of our participants have their location next to them. We really like to see where everybody's joining us from. So if you're able to just click on the option next to your name to rename yourself and you can put your location in, or if you want to pop it in the chat as well, either I or Sarah can go ahead and update your location. So do we have any other guesses about which of my wolf facts we think is false? I know we have a couple of schools that just have our students popping in here, so I don't know if they've had a chance to come to a consensus or not. So for this first one, the false one here is C. So a wolf pup is only about 1 pound. So they're actually very little when they're born.
That's
so just
so
little
tiny.
1 pound pups. Yeah. Not a big 5 pounder. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Little baby puppies. Yeah. So we'll do another one. My next one though is about elk because in Yellowstone, there's also a lot of elk. So we're going to talk about them as well. They're one of the wolves' most common prey. So our second question for the trivia here, guys, is which of these elk facts do we think is false? So do we think that elk are one of the largest deer species? Both male and female can grow antlers. They have 4 stomachs, or they are herbivores. And I underline that one because it might be a new word for some of you. So herbivores means they eat plants. So which of these do we think is false? You guys can go ahead and type it in the chat. Let me know what you think.
And the same to our friends on YouTube. I am on YouTube as well. And so please type your guesses into the chat and I will get them over from YouTube into our meeting here to Rebecca and Dr. Boyce.
Hey, Wandering Spirit, they think it's C. They think false that they do not have 4 stomachs. I wish I had 4 stomachs because I love eating a lot. That would be wonderful. Madame Peleg says A. We've got a couple of B's. Oh, a whole mixture of guesses coming in here. Awesome. Oh, our 5-6 crew from Hamilton, they've got a couple guesses, B and A. Okay, so our correct answer for this one, the false fact, is the antlers. It's actually only the male elk that can grow antlers. So this picture that I have on here, this is a bull. So he has antlers because he's a male. They use them to fight each other and to mark up trees. So good job to everybody that guessed B. We had a lot of correct guesses on that one. And I have one more quick trivia question while we wait for our last couple schools. Which of the following is the main reason for a decline in wild populations on Earth? What is happening to all of our wild animals? Do they overhunt their prey? Is there too many fires and floods? Is there too much competition between the animals? Or is it habitat destructions by humans? So what is causing the decline in all of our wild animal species across the planet? There's a lot of things that are causing a decline, but there's one really big baddie that is having the biggest impact on all of our wild species. And while we get our guesses in on this one too, if you guys would like to let us know next to your name where you're joining us from, I know we have a few new faces in our group here. So if you want to go ahead and let us know what city you're joining us from or what province or what country, that would be awesome. Oh, you know what? I'm asking people to tell us where they're joining from, and I did not put my city on my name. Whoops.
It's all about setting a good example. So if you need to know how to rename, you can find your picture on the side there, and there'll be 3 dots right by where you are. You click those 3 dots and you'll be able to rename. Now, if you're working on a smartboard or just a little confused, no worries. Pop it in the chat, send it to everyone, and I'll be able to edit on our side. No problem.
Awesome. Okay, well, answer for our last one here. Lots of good guesses. A lot of you guys think it's D. We had a couple A's. The correct answer is D. So humans destroying natural habitat is by far the biggest reason that we're losing wild animals. So good job to everybody. Thank you for participating in my trivia. You guys are geniuses as always. I tried to make them non-Googleable this time, so I think you guys actually got them. So it seems like, Dr. Boyce, we have a lot of elk and wolf experts in the crowd for our event today, which should be really good. So that's it. Let's get started. Welcome and good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we will have a couple more schools pop in as we get going here. So if you're popping in later, you're just joining, good morning and welcome to you. Our event today is on endangered species. So we are going to be learning about one particular area, the Yellowstone, and talking about how we have tried to help endangered species in that area, specifically looking at wolves. So I hope you guys like wolves because that's going to be our focus for today. I did do that little trivia right off the bat so we could practice typing in the chat because that's the best way to interact with us during this event. So if you guys have a comment or a question, you can just go ahead and type it right in the chat. I'll be watching it the whole time. So if there's something really great that comes up, we will go ahead and answer that as soon as we get to it. And that's the best way. So if you guys see something in the chat, go ahead and type it in there. As well, there is the option to raise your hand. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's the option for reactions and you can raise your hand. If you have someone that wants to ask a question on microphone or on video, that is awesome as well. We love to see and hear you guys. So if you would like to ask your question that way, raise your hand and we will get to you as well. Before we get going on the content, I would love to do a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Wet'suwet'en. So this is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. I would like to also take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that we're each joining from. Since we're meeting on a virtual platform, it's important to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today across Canada and across the entire world. We acknowledge our lands to reaffirm our commitment to improving the relationships and understanding of Indigenous peoples and to strengthen our connection and respect for our homes. The lands that we're on are all interconnected, and our choices of how we interact with these lands have real consequences that affect living things across the globe. So I invite all of you today that are participating to really focus on this connection that you have with the land and take some time to learn more about how those living things interact and how nature interacts with each other, because that is going to be the main focus of today's event. Also, speaking of participating schools, look at this list of participating schools. This is crazy. So thank you so much to everybody for signing up and joining us today for this event. There's so many of you. I don't have time to call every single one of you out, but I did take some time to put you up here. So take a minute, see if you can find your school on there. We have tons of schools across Canada. We've got schools across the world joining us today. So hopefully I didn't miss anyone. If you guys are joining us today on YouTube or on Zoom and you don't see your name on the list, take a second to say good morning in the chat so we can say hi to you guys as well. Thank you for joining us, and let's get right to it. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing, we do have our presenter first running his presentation for about 25 minutes, and we will try to save some time at the end for questions. But again, if you guys do have questions throughout the event, ask away. Okay, we will try to answer them as we go. We definitely do not need to save them all to the end. So if you have a burning question, please type it in the chat. And the last thing before we get started is our activity. So I sent out this activity a couple weeks ago to your teachers. If you didn't have time to print it, it's not the end of the world. All your students need is a piece of paper and a pencil to participate. But I would love to be able to see some of these at the end of the event. So if you guys are watching today and you have this activity in front of you, work really hard on it because we want to see it on camera and we want to see what you come up with. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have read this book or been able to see this movie, The Bad Guys, but it is about wolves who are bad guys that are actually good guys, which is what our event is about today. So what our activity is to create a wanted or a missing poster. Now you can do a wanted poster if you want to do it about a bad guy. You can do a missing poster if you want to do it about a good guy, but you're going to pick an animal to draw about. So maybe you want to do a wolf. You want to do a bad guy wolf. We're going to get a good picture of a wolf in here. You get to come up with a name for him or her. You get to have a reward for how much money they get for catching him. And then see if there's a few interesting things that you learn about that wolf during the presentation today that you can put in here, right? Maybe you want to do it about an elk or a cougar or a grizzly bear. Maybe there's an animal that lives around you that you want to do it about that's not in the presentation. That works too. So go ahead and get your pencils out, get your colors out. We want to see your wanted and missing posters. This is what I want you guys to work on while this presentation is running today. Awesome. So now that we have that all organized, we can finally get to the good stuff. Our wonderful presenter, Dr. Mark Boyce. So Dr. Boyce grew up on a farm in Iowa and went to the university at Yale in Connecticut and Oxford in England. He received his first teaching job at the University of Wyoming, and that's where he started his studies in Yellowstone National Park. He started working on elk, then wolves, and finally on grizzly bears. Wolves were captured west of Edmonton and released in Yellowstone in 1995, and the population increased rapidly. But then everything settled down, but changes occurred because vegetation was affected by the elk. And he is going to tell the rest of the story. So welcome, Dr. Boyce.
Thank you. I'll try to get my screen share to work.
Yep, it looks great.
There we go. Okay, so I have been working in Yellowstone since 1977. I had one of my first graduate students worked on elk in the Jackson Hole area, just south of Yellowstone. And I've been doing a number of studies over the years, but I'll be talking about some of that work today. Wolves were extirpated from Yellowstone National Park in 1926. The National Park Service was directly responsible for extirpating wolves from Yellowstone. At that time, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there were good animals and there were bad animals, and wolves were considered bad animals. And so wolves and cougars were shot, they were poisoned, they did everything they could to get rid of them. But then what happened was the elk population just took off because there were no predators on the elk. And so the number of elk became very high, almost 30,000 elk in the park. And so then the parks decided, well, we've got to do something about this. So they implemented a cull. And what that means is that rangers were shooting large numbers of elk, and they would slaughter the elk and put them in refrigerated semi trucks and drive them off to the Crow Indian Reservation north of Yellowstone. But they recognized that they'd made a big mistake by eliminating wolves, And so they initiated a program to try to get wolves back in the park. And this was hugely controversial because ranchers don't like wolves because they'll eat cattle. So they had to convince Congress, U.S. Congress, that it was okay to reintroduce wolves into the park. And that's where I came in because I had been doing work on elk in the area, and I was asked if I wouldn't prepare models to anticipate the consequences of wolf reintroduction. And so this is my book. I wrote this book on the Jackson elk herd. So the Jackson elk herd is south of the park, but they go into the park in the summertime. It's a migratory herd. And so I'd done quite a bit of work on elk in the park, and so the park wanted me to be involved. And this is John Varley, and he was the director of the Yellowstone Center for Resources at the time. And he's the one who strong-armed me into working on this project to anticipate the consequences of wolf recovery. This is him talking to George H.W. Bush, who was president of the United States at the time of the 1988 Yellowstone fires. And that's when I became engaged on this process of trying to anticipate the consequences of wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone, that went into a big report that went to Congress, and Congress finally approved wolf reintroduction, and it happened in 1995. The wolves came from west of Edmonton. In fact, I know several of the trappers who were involved in capturing the wolves, and they were put in a plane and flown to Yellowstone, and then they were kept in these pens. And you can see this is one of the Alberta wolves being released into a pen, and they had 3 of these pens in Yellowstone Park, and they fed them roadkills and kept them in the pens for, I think, about 3 months before they actually opened the gates then and allowed them to go outside. But the wolves did amazingly well. And in fact, we were amazed at how well they did. So the numbers of wolves increased quite rapidly. And the predictions that I made about what the consequences of wolf reintroduction would be were mostly on target. For the most part, I had it right. Wolves and ungulates, so ungulates being elk and bison and deer and moose, they coexist just fine. I mean, wolves depend upon these ungulates as prey, but there were some things that I didn't have quite right. One was that they were really specialized on elk. They killed the occasional bison, they killed the occasional moose, deer, bighorn sheep, even a mountain goat one time, but 90%, over 90%, some years 95% of the prey were elk, and they were really good at it. And so wolves ate substantial numbers of elk, and that influenced the numbers of elk in the park, as the Park Service anticipated that it would do. Now, I've got 3 graphs in here, and I'll try to explain these graphs, but I think they're important because they explain some really key features of wolf predation. Now, look at the yellow bars here. This is called a histogram, a bar graph, and this shows the age of elk shot by hunters. So if you look at the yellow bars, that's the age of elk shot by hunters when the elk leave the park to the north. And you can see that most of the elk are kind of prime age elk, the ones shot by hunters. So ages 2 to, well, actually age 1 to maybe 9. Those are the primary ages of elk shot by hunters, but the ages of elk taken by wolves is very different. So these dark red bars it shows the age distribution of wolves, of elk killed by wolves. And you can see very clearly a big difference here. And wolves eat mostly older elk. So once an elk is 10, 11, 12 years old, they start to slow down and they become easier prey for the wolves. And the wolves really take older aged elk. And what that means is that hunters are having a much bigger effect on the elk population than wolves are having on the elk population because of the ages that are taken. So prime age cow elk, these are all female elk. Prime age female elk from age 2 to age 10 are the ones that produce most of the babies. And the older ones aren't as productive and they don't live that much longer. And so those are the ones being taken by wolves. And so there's a big difference in predation. Another thing that I got wrong in my initial predictions for what would happen with wolf reintroduction was we did not anticipate how important grizzly bears were. Grizzly bears were taking almost 50% of the elk calves that were born in the park. And we did not anticipate that. Grizzly bears are very good predators on elk calves, and there are lots of grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park. Another predator that we, again, did not anticipate would be an important predator were cougars. And cougars were largely eliminated at the time that wolves were eliminated. But cougar numbers came back on their own. They were not reintroduced because there were a few cougars around. Their numbers gradually increased and peaked out about the same time that wolves were reintroduced. And so cougars did contribute as well to the mortality of elk in the park. But this is kind of this graph, and this one's called a line graph. This one also shows some of the key results that we observed in the park after wolf reintroduction. So wolf reintroduction happened in 1995, and it peaked out about 2003. And then there was a canine parvovirus outbreak that caused some mortality of the wolves, but they bounced right back from that. And then the numbers of wolves on the northern range settled down to about 40 to 45. In the entire park, there are about 100 wolves, but the numbers have leveled off and they stayed about the same until today. So this graph just goes up to 2017, but we're at 2022 right now, but it's about the same. Hasn't really changed over the last 10 years. But the number of elk has decreased from peak numbers of about 15,000 here, down, and it's settled down around 5 to 8,000. And so it's stayed pretty steady as well, with the numbers of elk and wolves kind of equilibrating, meaning they kind of found a happy medium. But the big change here that we have not anticipated, and we still don't know what's going to happen, is that bison have really increased. So bison numbers were pretty low at the time that wolves were reintroduced, but they have just gradually increased and become more and more abundant. And today there are about 5,000 bison in Yellowstone National Park. And where that's going to go, we don't know. And it'll be very interesting to follow that. So in our research, trying to study what went on during wolf reintroduction, wolf recovery, we have this idea of what's called a trophic cascade. So a trophic level means you have predators. Predators eat herbivores, and herbivores eat plants. So those are trophic levels. So the predators are the top level trophic level, elk are the middle level trophic level, and the vegetation is at the bottom. wolves eat elk. If you increase the number of wolves, that causes a decrease in the number of elk, and that results in an increase in vegetation. Now, exactly how that happens has been part of the focus of our research. Some people argue that it's all related to the numbers of wolves and the numbers of elk. But another possibility is that the elk are afraid of the wolves and they choose their habitats to avoid the wolves. And so the food chain, that is how these trophic levels roll out, is that wolves eat elk and elk eat the vegetation. Now, the vegetation that we've studied primarily has been the woody vegetation because that's where the most dramatic effects are.
Dr. Boyce, could I
yes.
interrupt you for 1 second before we get to the willows? Because we do have a couple questions that I think are kind of closely related to this last
Good.
slide.
Okay.
Just came in from YouTube. So we have one is asking, originally, why did the wolf numbers drop? Why did we have to reintroduce wolves in the first place?
Because the Park Service killed them all. In 1926, they killed the last wolf in the park. And like I said in one of my first slides, there were good animals and bad animals, and wolves were thought to be bad animals. And so we, meaning humans, killed them all. And so they were gone. And there were no wolves in Western United States in 1995. There were none in the Western half of the United States.
Right, because humans just thought that they were bad, so we wanted to get rid of all of them.
Yes.
You're not always very smart. The second question is kind of closely related. That are people allowed to hunt in Yellowstone now, like wolves or bears or cougars or anything?
No, there's no hunting in the national park. And I'll come back to that point because it's a very important one about the value of national parks.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, so we wanted to study the vegetation to see whether the wolves were having an effect on the elk that were having an effect on the vegetation. And so one of the components of vegetation that the elk had a big effect on was willow. And willow, of course, grows in areas along streams. And in the wintertime, elk really hammer willow. If it's in their winter range, they will feed on the willow stems in the wintertime. And so we wanted to look to see how much the elk were affecting the growth of willow. And so my student, Hawthorne Beyer, did these cross sections. So this is a cross section of a willow stem, and you can see these growth rings. They're called annuli. And these growth rings vary depending on how good the growth conditions were in a particular year. And so the growth was the growth by the willow was determined by the amount of area in these donut-shaped rings surrounding the center of the willow stem. And we use that to show that indeed elk were having a big effect on the growth of willow. And it was really evident in some places. So this photo was taken in the Blacktail Plateau, which is west of Mammoth in Yellowstone Park. But it's an area where it's fairly open, and elk avoid this area in the wintertime because wolves are prevalent and they kill elk in this area. And so elk have kind of avoided this particular valley and plateau. And so you can see the willow is very tall. There's a bison in the middle, laid down in the middle of this photo. There's a bison, and you can see how tall the willow is around here because there has not been so much elk herbivory. But here's another place close to Mammoth where the elk really concentrate in the wintertime, even now, even with wolves. And here's a fence that was put around this stand of willow in 1958. And inside the fence, and this is a tall fence. It's an 8-foot. These posts are 8 foot tall, and inside the exclosure, the willow are 10, 12 feet tall, huge. But outside there are no willow stems because the elk raise them down even now. So in places where elk concentrated on winter range, even today, the elk continue to have a big effect on the vegetation. Another species that was really affected in the park by elk after wolves were eliminated was cottonwood. And at the time that wolves were released, there were a few old cottonwood in the Yellowstone Valley, but there was no reproduction by the cottonwoods, because anytime that a small cottonwood would grow, the elk would nip it off during the winter time. But since wolf reintroduction, we've had approximately 1 million new cottonwoods established in the park. And so the release from herbivory by elk, afforded by wolf reintroduction, has had a huge effect on the growth of cottonwoods in the park, again, in the riparian areas, meaning along streams. So we did some experiments to look at the effect that herbivory was having, but also beavers, because beavers had been eliminated by elk. Elk had browsed all of the riparian vegetation, meaning all of the willows and aspen near the streams were eliminated by elk, and so beavers were eliminated. So we did some experiments to see what kind of response would occur by having beavers back in the park and having vegetation in the park. And we measured the vegetation to see what kind of response we would get. And this just shows an illustration of what happened. And here is an exclosure where there was an artificial dam, and elk had been eliminated by fencing. And you can see lush growth of willow. This is a control area where there was no fencing and no dam. Down here, it was dammed, but there was no fence. And so there's some willow growth here, but what really did the trick was having beavers and reduced herbivory. So to get some of the details of the behavior of the animals, we put radio collars on elk. And we captured the elk using a helicopter with a net gun, and then we put a radio collar on the elk and did it goes really fast. Basically, they get caught in the net, and then you jump on them and put the collar on and let them go. No tranquilizers or anything, just a really quick, put the collar on and let them go again. And then we could follow them and get really detailed behavioral information about where they went and what they did. And we found indeed that elk were avoiding places where wolves had dens. And so where wolves had concentrations of activity around their dens where they had puppies, elk learned those places and they avoided them. So there was a behavioral response, as well as this numerical response that we've already looked at, meaning a numerical response, meaning the numbers of elk and the numbers of wolves changed over time. But one
Sorry,
of the things
Dr. Boyce, I have one more quick question kind of related to that. Two questions about that picture with the elk. Is it dangerous to have to catch elk that way, to just kind of like net them and jump onto them?
Yes. And that's why we hire these guys to do it.
So you don't do it. You hire other people to do it for you.
We have studies going on here in Alberta as well, and we hire these guys. Clay, the guy on the right, runs an outfit called Bighorn Helicopters, and that's their job. They specialize in doing this kind of work, wildlife capture work, and it is dangerous. And I'm glad to have these guys doing it so that my students don't die.
Got to get new grad students every year. That's cool. So, man, if any of you guys watching like flying and are into wildlife, that could be a definite career option for you one day. Wild elk wrangler.
A dangerous career option.
Yeah. So that actually leads me to a couple other questions that we had from YouTube.
Okay.
Wolves, are wolves dangerous? So I know when you go on hikes, they tell you to be careful of grizzlies and cougars and stuff. Are wolves dangerous to humans like some other wildlife are?
Not really. There's only one known case of a human being killed by wolves in North America, and that was in a situation in northern Saskatchewan where the wolves were being fed near a mining camp, and so the wolves had become habituated. But in general, no, wolves do not attack people. Now they can, and in the old world, there are situations where, meaning in Europe and Asia, there are situations where wolves have killed people, and in particular children. And so in northern India, there are about 60 to 80 children killed by wolves every year. Even
Wow.
that. And the reason is that the children are sometimes put out with a group of goats, and I've seen this where there'll be a 8 or 10-year-old kid out watching a group of goats, and the goats can run faster than the kid can, and wolves sometimes take those kids, and also when the kids go out at night to pee, the wolves will pick them off sometimes. And so North India is a dangerous place for people and wolves, but again, it's almost always children. And the same thing happened in Europe 200 years ago. Exactly the same phenomenon where kids were sent out with a group of sheep or goats, and these fables, they're not really fables, but these stories like Little Red Riding Hood come from that European experience with wolves. So especially children can be vulnerable to wolves. Kids should always stay with their parents or with other kids.
Especially if you're putting them around a food source like a bunch of goats.
That's true. So in general, though, in North America, it just hasn't happened. And but I'm sure that it used to. A couple hundred years ago, First Nation people, I'm sure, had bad experiences with wolves. But in general, cougars and bears are much more dangerous to humans than our
also I'm looking to see now if our India school joined today. This would be a very scary story to them, but I don't see them in our meeting, so nope, not today. There's one last question I have before I let you keep going, and this is just a little one-off. I don't know if you know it or not, but do you know why wolves howl?
It's communication. So identifying territories and establishing boundaries for their territories. So oftentimes wolves will howl more frequently near the boundaries of their territories, and wolves that cross that territorial boundary are oftentimes killed by other wolves. In Yellowstone, the biggest cause of death by wolves are other wolves, always, and they're highly territorial. Pack sizes in Yellowstone run between 6 and 8. And if a wolf from one territory gets into another territory, it'll be attacked and killed by the other wolves. Oh, wow. So the wolves are highly territorial, and the howling and other displays like urinating. They oftentimes urinate on the boundary of their territories, just like dogs, you know, they'll, whenever they go by a signpost, they'll lift a leg. Well, that's marking their territories. And wolves do it much more right around the boundaries of their territories, that they defend aggressively toward other wolves.
Very interesting. Cool. Okay. Thank you very much for your answers.
So we put the radio collars on the elk, and we also had radio collars on wolves. The park did that work. We did the work on the elk. But one of the things we learned was that where the wolves were killing elk depended on the vegetation. And the most dangerous place for an elk is an open aspen stand like this one, where the wolves can see the elk and they can also sneak up on it. But when confronted by wolves and elk in habitat like this, the elk did one of two things. Most commonly, they would go into the black timber, meaning they go into the pine and spruce conifer forests. But the other thing that they would oftentimes do, and depends on the juxtaposition of habitat, but sometimes they go out in the open. And so you see large groups of elk standing in Yellowstone National Park in the wintertime, out in the open where they can see all around them. And that way they can see the wolves when they're approaching, and they can run away. But the most dangerous place for an elk is vegetation just like this. And we showed that elk, when confronted with wolves, move out of this type of vegetation because they recognize that it's dangerous. But also we found that the mortality events, that is where wolves were killing elk, was most frequent in vegetation like this. So there is a behavioral response as well as a numerical response, meaning the numbers of elk were being affected by the wolf. But we did, you know, there was a lot of publicity about our wolf and elk story, and some of the media coverage basically makes it sound as though wolves are just doing fantastic things and that we need wolves here, there, and everywhere. But Dave Meach, who is probably the world's leading expert on wolves, wrote an article in which he said, "Is science sanctifying the wolf?" Meaning this research that we've done in Yellowstone was being used by people to advocate wolf reintroduction in places where it probably wouldn't work out very well. And what Dave pointed out was that livestock biomass, meaning cattle in particular, is much greater than that of wild ungulates on most Western rangelands. So what that means is there are a lot more cows out there than there are elk and moose and deer. And so that's an important consideration, because a lot of the vegetation is being used by livestock instead of wildlife. But also hunters alter the distribution and abundance of elk and other ungulates. And so I had a graduate student, Andrea Morehouse, who lives near Pincher Creek in southwestern Alberta, and she studied what the wolves were feeding on in this area outside of a national park in southwestern Alberta, where there's a juxtaposition of forested landscape in the Rocky Mountains, and then right near there, a lot of grazing country that's grassland just to the east of this forest reserve. And so we had radio collars on the wolves, and we would look to see where we got repeated relocations of the wolves at the same spot. So if we had 5 or 6 relocations at the same spot, it's probably because they were eating something. And so then we went in on each of these relocation clusters of points that we got from the radio telemetry to see what they'd been eating. And during the grazing season, meaning from May through October, 45% of the animals killed by wolves were cattle. And it's no wonder that ranchers just hate wolves because they have a big effect on their operations. Here you can see 22% of the prey killed by wolves were deer, 13% were elk, 9% moose, and then they were taking some other prey as well. But cattle during the growing season in the backcountry of southwestern Alberta were taking lots of cattle.
So Dr. Boyce, sorry, before we do our kind of final wrap up, I just wanted to say a quick note to our classes. If anybody has posters that they wanted to show, I know we don't always are able to read the chat, but if any of our classes has posters that you'd like to show, if you could just let me know in the chat that you have some students interested. Okay, yeah, I do say Ghislaine Gagnon, you guys are interested. So we will just let Dr. Boyce do a final wrap up here. If you could do it in maybe 2 to 3 minutes, Dr. Boyce, that would be awesome. And then we can hopefully take the last 10 minutes to do a little bit of show and tell.
Okay, yeah, this is my last slide.
Perfect.
Our phone's ringing. I gotta turn this off. One sec.
Okay. Well, actually, I guess while he's doing that, we can go ahead and head over to Ghislaine Gagnon. You guys can show us your stuff right now, which would be great. Let me
Take
just
care of that. Okay, so what did we learn? One of the punchlines in this story was that that trophic level interactions, meaning the interaction between wolves and ungulates and vegetation, are dynamic, meaning they're always changing, both in space and in time. There's an enormous amount of variation from place to place in where the elk browsing really has a big effect on the vegetation, but there are also complications associated with variation in the soils and moisture. So it's a highly heterogeneous landscape, meaning highly variable. And we see both numerical, meaning numbers of elk and numbers of wolves have fluctuated over time, but we've also seen these behavioral responses, meaning the landscape of fear. The elk are going to places to avoid wolves that they're afraid of. And the effect of these trophic level interactions, the effect of these interactions between the predators and the herbivores and the vegetation have increased the variation, increased the variability on the landscape and also over time. And one of the important things that parks do for us is to provide an ecological baseline reserve so we can see what happens if we don't have cattle and we don't have hunters. We can see in the parks what everything would be like if we had minimal human intervention. So this is what we call ecological process management. We're focusing on trying to maintain natural ecological processes like predator-prey and like beavers that influence the vegetation and like fire that influences the vegetation. And a big one that we don't yet know what's going to happen is bison. So we've got increasing numbers of bison. Ranchers in areas surrounding Yellowstone Park just hate bison because they walk through fences, they compete with cattle for forage. And so how we're going to manage bison, Europeans eliminated bison during the 1870s. And we have opportunities in some places like Banff National Park in Alberta and Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho, where bison are coming back. And how that's going to roll out remains to be seen. So it's very exciting to see what's going to happen over the next 20 years with bison in the park. So just a few names of people and organizations that have funded our work that I just must mention. National Geographic Society was one of the first to get in there and fund our research, and all these other organizations as well. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Wonderful. We do have a couple questions. I'm just going to get this class going first because I would love to see what they were working on, but I do see there's a couple questions in the chat. So wait right there. Gillian Gagnon, I'm going to go ahead and put you guys on spotlight so that we can all see the beautiful artwork that you guys did for us. So you guys can go ahead and get started on showing us your wanted and missing. Oh my gosh, and they even have color. Do you guys see this? Beautiful bad bumblebee. These are great. Bad bee. And while they are showing off their wonderful work, there is a couple questions here for you, Dr. Boyce, in the chat. There's a video from Sustainable Human, and I think I know what video Sylvain's talking about, where it talks about how the rivers themselves are healthier after those wolves came in. Do you know anything about that, or how accurate that video is, or can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a little exaggerated, I think, but there certainly have been responses in the riparian area. So riparian means the areas immediately next to a stream or a river. And the reason is that when elk numbers were really high, elk eat willow, and they eat aspen, and they eat other vegetation that grows along the stream sides. And so now that we have more woody vegetation, we also have beavers. Beavers have come back, and so that alters the whole structure of this stream system. Beavers build dams, and then we have willow, and there are many birds that nest in those willow stands. Yellow warblers, for example, are a really common one in the park. But a number of other species that are associated with this riparian vegetation, including otters and mink, muskrats, many species of waterfowl, buffleheads and mergansers, and many different species that live now in this riparian zone that was so affected by elk before we got wolves back. So yes, there's a lot of truth in that video. I think it might be a little overstated in places, and some of the people in the park they sort of cringe when they see that video, because it seems to make some very strong statements that might be a little stronger than we're comfortable with. Certainly no question but what there is an effect on the vegetation.
So helps, but we don't know how much it really helps.
So I've just added a few more spotlights so that we can see a few more classes at the same time, because I saw that Sylvain's class was sharing and Miss Skevington's class is also sharing. So we have 3 spotlights going on here.
And Madame Peleg's class as well in St. Albert said.
Okay, let's see if I can get another.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for that answer. There's a couple more in here. Ooh, this is a broad question. What is the most endangered species, and how can we as students help endangered species?
Well, in Alberta right now, one of the most endangered species is the sage-grouse. And sage-grouse live in southeastern Alberta in sagebrush habitat, Artemisia cana type habitat, and they do not do well when there's human disturbance. And there's been so much oil development in southeastern Alberta that it has eliminated sage-grouse from most of southeastern Alberta. There used to be about 2,000 sage-grouse in southeastern Alberta. There used to be a hunting season for sage-grouse. And now there are, I think, last year there were like 35 males and about the same number of females, so less than 100 total. And their numbers have declined very precipitously, again, directly associated with oil and gas development. So that's probably the most endangered species. We also have some other ones that are not doing well. Black swifts that occur in some of the mountain areas near Banff, for example. There's a snail that occurs in Banff that's highly endangered. Species that have really restricted distributions oftentimes are not doing very well.
And the second part was, what can students do? What could students do to help out these endangered species in their area?
I think learning about endangered species is important, so that they know how their government representatives are dealing with some of these issues, and so that they know how to vote if conservation issues are a priority. Different parties have different positions on conservation, and so choosing your representatives, choosing your MLA, for example, to be somebody who is conscious of conservation values is probably one of the most important things we can do.
And we have time for one last quick question that came over from YouTube. Will the wolves disappear if they're not protected by the Endangered Species Act?
Well, they won't disappear from Yellowstone Park. They're there to stay. The Endangered Species Act is that in the United States is federal legislation. And there are conservation measures by the states as well. So wolves will not disappear from the Western United States again. It would require a very concerted effort to extirpate them, like we did during the 1920s and 30s, meaning we'd have to poison them, an all-out assault on wolves to get rid of them now. We now have over 2,000 wolves in the northern Rocky Mountain states of the United States. In Alberta, we have about 7,000 wolves. Wolves are totally secure, I think.
Good. That's good to hear. Awesome. Kate, thank you very much for answering all those questions. Before I do my last thank you and goodbyes, I just wanted to do a quick reminder to all of our schools watching. We have one final elementary event happening this year on June 8th, World Oceans Day. So we're going to be talking about a few super interesting key organisms that live in the ocean and what we can do to help them. We're pairing again with our friends at OceanWise and Green Learning for this one. So if you like today's event and you want to do more, we've got one more great one coming up. So you can either scan this QR code, or actually I can go ahead and pop the link in the chat as well. You can go ahead and follow that link and sign up for our World Oceans Day if you haven't already. I will leave that up for a minute in case you guys need to scan it. And I would just like to say thank you once again, Dr. Boyce. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise in this area. Super duper interesting, so much great content. Thank you to all of our schools who joined and who participated in our little activity. We loved seeing your artwork. It's like every time we do an activity, your artwork is getting better and better. I was very, very impressed. So thank you for taking the time to share that with us. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Dr. Boyce, for coming today.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We will see you guys next time. Thanks so much. Merci.